In 1972, 8 nuns boarded a bus for a silent retreat in the mountains of Crescent County. They were never seen again. No crash, no wreckage, no explanation. For over 50 years, the church offered only one word: incident. But when the bus is pulled from the bottom of Morning Lake in 2025, still chained shut, what's found inside isn't just evidence. It's a message, one candle, one rosary, and a name that was never on the original list. Before we begin, subscribe to uncover stories the church tried to bury, and help make sure no silence stays sacred forever. The drought came without thunder, without warnings from the hills. It crept in slowly, like something old remembering how to swallow. By late June, the reservoir feeding St. Cathar's Lake was lower than anyone had seen in 40 years. By early July, the silt floor began to crack. On the 5th day of that month, when the sun pressed hardest against the skin of Crescent County, a shape rose from the lake bed. It was a fisherman who saw it first, a man named Arlo Jesnick, who swore he never fished on Wednesdays. But that morning, he'd woken uneasy. Something about the air. He cast his line near the southern curve where the water had receded into shallow veins. And there it was. A rusted roof, rounded at the corners, flaking yellow paint beneath a coat of algae and time. He thought it was a delivery van at first, maybe from the old retreat center that once stood uphill. But then he saw the cross insignia welded on the side, dulled with age but unmistakable. Benediction order. Transport. By nightfall, Sheriff Cora Reyes stood on the bank, boots deep in cracked mud, staring at the half-submerged skeleton of a monastery transport bus that hadn't moved in 5 decades. The door was chained shut from the outside. The excavation was cautious, respectful. The sheriff had seen what happened when people treated the past like something owed to them. She brought in a preservation team from the university and waited until the forensic crew had cleared every vine, every root, before stepping inside. The bus creaked as her boots crossed the threshold. The air was sour with damp fabric and rust, the scent of something once sacred that had long ago given up being remembered. Seats remained in place. Most of them. Dust lay in undisturbed layers. A broken mirror hung near the driver's seat, its edges still reflecting in slivers. But it was what sat beneath the 3rd row on the left that made Cora still. A leather satchel, buckled tight, wrapped in wax cloth. Inside, a rosary. 3 handwritten pages, 1 pressed wildflower, and a journal bearing a water-stained inscription. Sister C. Holloway, 1972, Our Lady of the Hollow Pines. She turned to the last entry. The ink was faded but legible. July 8, 1972. We were told not to speak, but he watches anyway. Even through the veil, even in silence. I no longer pray out loud. He listens there too. They sealed the site by morning. Reporters would want to know what was found. Parish historians might try to intervene. But Cora Reyes knew how fragile the truth was when too many hands reached for it at once. She stood by the chain door and looked out over the cracked lake bed. The wind was dry. The air held no sound. Even the crows, usually so fond of watching, had kept away that day. There were 8 names listed in the old 1972 file. 8 young women, ages 20 to 26, who had boarded a monastery bus bound for a secluded spiritual retreat, part of a seasonal rite known only to certain novitiates within the benediction order. They had never arrived. No report of a crash, no distress call, no search party that reached the public. Just a closed case file marked incomplete records, presumed accidental disappearance. Cora had requested the file 2 years earlier on a quiet hunch. Her mother once whispered about the Hollow Pines, but no one in Crescent County ever talked about that place for long, or twice. Now, standing in the belly of the bus, the walls pressing like held breath, she felt the echo of something waiting. That evening, in her office lined with forgotten records and heat-warped floorboards, Cora flipped through the journal. The handwriting began steady, then grew thinner, more careful, as if each word had to pass through something tight and watching. Most entries were mundane, notes about daily tasks, meal prayers, reflections on obedience and simplicity. But halfway through, the tone shifted. Father Elroy doesn't speak much when he drives. He just stares straight ahead. His hands never move. We passed the same curve 3 times today, I swear it. The same tree, with the notch in the bark. Sister Claire noticed too. She made the sign of the cross with her left hand. No one corrected her, no one spoke at all. There was no mention of arrival, no date after July 8th. Cora closed the journal gently, like one would a book of spells half-whispered. She drove home past dusk. The county roads had always comforted her. Long stretches of pine and silence, the occasional porch light flickering through the trees like a lighthouse for the lost. But tonight, they felt less familiar, less still. Her mother had attended Our Lady of the Hollow Pines as a postulant in 1967. She'd left after 1 year without explanation, said nothing about why, kept her veil folded in a cedar box, never spoke of it again. But once, when Cora was 10, she remembered waking to the sound of her mother whispering in her sleep. A string of names, not prayers, just names. And one stuck with her, Cassiel. That name wasn't on the 1972 list. At midnight, she called the diocesan archive line. A voicemail. She left her badge number, case reference, and a quiet request. Please check any record connected to Sister Cassiel Holloway, Benediction Order, Crescent County, year 1972, possibly related to the recent transport discovery. She paused, then added softly, and if she was never supposed to be there, I'd like to know why. Outside her window, the wind lifted through the pine boughs. In the old cathedral register across town, ink long faded under plexiglass protection. One final entry remained barely legible beneath an oil stain. Transfer confirmed. Sister Cassiel Holloway. July 7th, 1972. Destination, the Hollow Pines. Notes. See restricted ledger. Benediction. Silence. The cabin sat near the tree line at the edge of Elk Hollow, its chimney crooked, shutters nailed closed against seasons that no longer threatened anyone. It didn't show up on most maps. You had to know which turn to miss, which creek crossing wasn't marked. Sheriff Cora Reyes parked at the base of the gravel drive and turned off the engine. The forest around her hushed. She didn't come with a warrant. She didn't need one. The name had surfaced in a footnote, one typed line buried in the parish's incident log, dated just weeks after the disappearance. Remaining postulant reassigned to non-vowed retreat, Sister Miriam Holloway, Crescent monastic initiate, deemed spiritually unready. A name never mentioned again. Never transferred, never professed, never buried. Just unready. Cora stepped out of the vehicle. The morning was cool, heavy with that damp smell of pine and secrets too long buried. She approached the cabin slowly. The screen door was patched with wire and prayer beads, tiny wooden crosses tied in loops along the edges. Something inside told her this wouldn't be a hostile visit, but not a welcome one either. She knocked. Silence. She knocked again. This time the door creaked inward a few inches, as if it had been waiting to be opened from the other side. A voice drifted out, soft and dry, like leaves being swept across a chapel floor. You waited longer than I expected. Miriam Holloway looked nothing like the photo Cora had seen in the monastery's 1969 yearbook. That girl had been soft-eyed and youthful, hair neatly pinned, gaze turned skyward in a quiet sort of hope. This woman was older, weathered, with deep lines beside her mouth. Not from frowning, but from holding things in too long. She wore a simple gray cardigan and a scarf wrapped around her neck. Her hair was white, cut close. Her hands were bare, except for a faint mark on the back of her left palm. Something that might once have been a burn or a brand Or maybe just a scar the church forgot to catalog. She didn't ask why Cora had come. She just stepped aside and gestured toward a wooden chair by the fireplace. Cora took it. The silence settled again, but not comfortably. It sat between them like a veil. "You're not surprised," Cora said finally. Miriam smiled without warmth. "That the bus was found?" She shook her head. "Number, I've always believed the lake would forget enough to give it back. You knew they were there." "Not until the dream started again," she replied. "And even then, it wasn't knowing. It was remembering what I tried not to." Cora opened the folder in her lap, laid the journal on the table between them. "Is this yours?" Miriam looked at the leather cover but didn't touch it. "It was, until I left it for them. I thought it might be the only piece that made it out." "It did." A long pause. "And the names?" Cora asked. "All 8, Miriam whispered. "But that's not the full number." Outside, the wind picked up. Inside, Miriam moved to the hearth, where an iron kettle sat warming but untouched. She poured 2 cups of tea. No sugar, no honey. Just water, leaf, and steam. "I was meant to go with them," she said, voice distant. "The day before the retreat I fell ill. A fever. Or maybe not. The Mother Superior said it was Providence, that my spirit wasn't ready." She handed Cora a cup, her fingers trembling just slightly. "That morning, I watched them leave from the refectory window. 8 women, silent, calm, dressed in full novitiate habit, though none had yet taken final vows. They boarded the transport without prayer. That wasn't normal." Cora's voice softened. "You noticed?" Miriam nodded. "We were a praying order. Everything began and ended with words offered upward. But that morning, they were told to be silent. No hymns, no scripture. Why? Because someone told them listening was safer." Cora leaned forward. "Who told them?" Miriam didn't answer at first. She walked to a drawer beneath the windowsill and pulled out a small notebook, worn leather, frayed at the spine. She opened it to the middle and placed it on the table. Inside, a drawing. A cross, but not the traditional kind. Its center was an eye. The arms of the cross didn't extend cleanly. They bent inward, like vines or roots folding back into themselves. The base of the drawing was shaded with downward strokes, like the cross was growing underground. "This was etched into the back of the monastery chapel," Miriam said, "hidden behind the altar panel. No one ever spoke of it, but every novice was shown it once." "Is it religious?" "Not in the way you mean," she said quietly. "It was called the Listening Cross. They said it marked those who were being prepared." "Prepared for what?" Miriam finally met Cora's gaze. "For the benediction silence." Cora sat very still. "That phrase," she said, "appears in the archived transport record, under restricted notes." "Then you've already come too far," Miriam whispered. "What does it mean?" "You won't find a definition in any seminary text," she replied. "It's a rite spoken of only in corridors. Whispers passed from older sisters to the ones the church called receivers." "Receivers?" Miriam nodded. "Not prophets, not saints, just those willing to hear what others wouldn't." "Hear what?" A long pause. Then, "What waits beneath the veil?" They sat in silence for a long time. The fire cracked gently in the hearth. Outside, the wind stirred the pine needles in long, whispering turns. Cora finally pulled a photograph from her folder. The original monastery photo from 1971. She slid it across the table. "You're in this," she said. "So are the others. But this girl," she pointed to the 9th figure, the one standing apart. "She's not listed in any roster." Miriam looked down. Her face went still. "She wasn't a postulant." "Then who was she?" Miriam's voice dropped. "She was sent to observe, not to join." "By the church?" A shake of the head. "By someone else." I never learned who. But her name was Sister Cassiel, and she came from an abbey that no longer appears on any map. And she's the one who, Miriam cut in quietly. She's the one who led the benediction rite. Cora swallowed. Did she survive? Miriam's hands gripped the edge of the table. No one survives the rite, she said softly. But not everyone disappears. That night, as Cora drove back through the trees, she kept seeing the drawing. The listening cross. Its roots burrowed into her thoughts like threads pulling something forgotten forward. At a red light, she opened the journal again. The final line of the July 8th entry, the one she hadn't seen before, lay faint in the crease of the page. It read, Cassiel says silence is not the absence of sound. It is the language of what watches from beneath. And beneath that, in even fainter ink, 2 more words. We listened. The county records building smelled like mildew and floor polish, an old blend that clung to paper as if the past refused to be separated from its pages. Sheriff Cora Reyes had always found it comforting, but not today. Today, it felt like she was walking into a room that had been expecting her. The archive clerk, a soft-spoken man named Jude, met her at the elevator with the gray carton already in hand. You called about the Hollow Pines disappearance, he said. I pulled the file, but there's something strange. He led her to the long wooden table in the center of the room. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like distant flies. Jude set the box down gently, lifting the lid as if it were an offering. Inside, manila folders marked in red pencil. Field Retreat, July 1972. Benediction Order, Transit 14. A status, unresolved N1, stamped clean across the front in faded red ink. Restricted, by order of Archdiocesan Office. 1973, do not duplicate, do not file publicly. Cora opened the files one by one. The first was a personnel log. Names, ages, assigned beds, final vows. Blank. Just sister names only. Sister Marguerite, Sister Lena, Sister Hester, Sister Claire, Sister Josephine, Sister Ruth, Sister Naima, Sister Odell 8. No Cassiel. But the edge of the page held a faint scrawl in graphite, barely noticeable unless angled toward the light. Plus 1 transit. Crossed into silence, logged under voice instead of name. Cora sat back. It was a line she didn't understand, and yet every part of her tensed reading it. What did it mean, logged under voice, and crossed into silence? The next folder held photographs. Black and white, edges curled from humidity. One was of the monastery courtyard, the last known photo taken before the bus departed. The 8 novitiates were visible, lined up with small satchels, faces unreadable under white veils. The bus driver stood off to the side. No name was listed, but he was older, weathered, wearing a thin clerical collar and what looked like gloves in the summer heat. At the back of the photo, partially obscured by shade, stood a 9th figure. No satchel, no veil. She wore a dark habit with a black cincture belt, not white. Her head was slightly bowed, and there, barely visible beneath the edge of her sleeve, was a mark on her wrist. Cora pulled out the magnifier from her coat pocket. The image grain was rough, degraded, but clear enough. The mark wasn't random. It was the listening cross, the same one Sister Miriam had shown her. Only now it was etched into skin. She looked at the transit log next. The driver's name had been entered by hand, then later struck through with 2 clean lines. Driver, Father Marcus Elroy. Note, no formal record of ordination found. In the margins, someone had penciled, possibly not clergy. Substitute arranged outside normal channels. Her skin chilled. No name, no ordination, no church record. Just given authority. For a retreat that was never recorded in parish bulletins. For a route not listed on any diocesan map. They were going somewhere, Cora whispered. But the church never planned to receive them. In the final folder, something heavier than paper. She pulled it out carefully. A thin piece of glass, preserved between two stiff sheets of archival board. Etched onto the glass, like a photographic plate, was a drawing. 8 kneeling figures. 1 standing. At the feet of the standing one, a circular mark on the ground, split by a vertical line like a door or a seal. Above the figures, the same words repeated 3 times. Silentia, Silentia, Silentia. In the bottom right corner, a date. July 7th, 1972. 1 day before the retreat. Jude returned with a fresh pot of coffee and paused when he saw the glass in Cora's hands. "You found the seal," he said. "You know it?" He nodded uneasily. "Archivists call it the benediction drawing. Nobody knows who filed it, but the same image has been found in 3 diocesan sites across the state, each time after an unsolved convent disappearance. The earliest was 1903, and it's never been explained?" "No," Jude said, "and those who ask about it too often don't tend to stay in the church long." That evening, Cora sat alone in her office. The lights were low. The glass etching leaned against a bookend like a stained glass relic without a frame. She stared at the drawing until her eyes blurred. What did it mean to kneel in silence? What did it mean to be marked to listen? And why did the 9th sister stand, not kneel? She opened her laptop and typed in the diocesan inquiry portal. Search, Sister Cassiel Holloway. Affiliation Benediction Order Region, Northern California years. Active, 1970 to 1973. The screen blinked, then responded, "No results found. Would you like to broaden your search to include non-vowed staff or external affiliates?" She clicked yes. This time, a result appeared. 1. A scanned intake form, half redacted. Name, Cassiel H. Classification, Observer, Liturgical Silence Program. Assigned, Crescent County, Trial Implementation Phase. Status, File sealed, 1973, by order of the Provincial Authority Annotation, retained under voice clearance only. The phrase again, voice clearance. Cora leaned back in her chair, whispering the words like they might unlock themselves just by being said aloud. She rose and crossed to her evidence board, pinned the photo of the 9th sister beside the transit list, drew a red string between Cassiel's silhouette and the listening cross. Beneath that, a note in her own handwriting, marked to stand, not to speak. And just beneath that, where was she sent if not to pray? At midnight, she returned to the storage room beneath the county cathedral. There, behind the unused sacristy door, she found what she didn't know she had come looking for. A drawer, misfiled under music archives. Inside, cassette tapes, no labels, no dates. She took one, slid it into the player on her desk, pressed play, static. Then, faint, slow breathing. A woman's voice, software almost reverent. "He is not the silence, he is what listens through it. The right is not to bless, it is to empty." Then quiet. Then one final whisper. "We were not the first, and we will not be the last." The ruins of Our Lady of the Hollow Pines sat about 18 miles west of Crescent County, past the old timber road where pavement gave way to dirt, and silence took over where cell service ended. Sheriff Cora Reyes didn't come with a team. She came alone. The sky above the pines was overcast, as if the sun had been instructed to wait. The trees stood tightly packed, the trunks black with sap and history. Birds didn't sing here. Even the wind moved differently, curling low to the ground like it didn't want to be seen. The monastery had burned sometime in the late 70s. Accidentally, the file had said. But enough remained. The bell tower had collapsed into itself. The stone arch of the main cloister still stood, its Latin inscription barely legible. "Be still, and you will hear." Cora stepped through what had once been the chapel door. Inside, vines crawled through broken stained glass and up along the crucifix still half hanging from a beam. The pews were gone. The altar had collapsed inward, its marble cracked, but the feeling, the strange, low hum in the silence, remained. She crossed to where the confessional would have stood. Its frame was still upright, the velvet curtain long gone. Beneath the confessional bench, her boot caught on something. She crouched. There, beneath a rotting floorboard, something glinted. She pried it loose with her pocket knife. A small silver locket. Inside, a folded piece of cloth, preserved from decay. She unfolded it gently, revealing a name embroidered in blue thread. Claire, one of the 8. But as she turned the cloth over, her breath caught. Etched faintly on the inside, using thread not ink, were words too small for decoration. I did not kneel. I only watched. Cora stood slowly, the cloth clutched in her hand. Not all the sisters had participated in the rite. One had remained apart. One had borne witness. That night, back at the station, Cora pulled up the Benedictine rite manuals she'd scanned earlier. Nothing spoke of the listening cross or the benediction silence. But in a scanned sermon from 1948, delivered at a now-defunct parish in Humboldt County, she found a single footnote. Some believe the oldest rites predate spoken scripture, that they are not meant to praise, but to receive. These were rites of listening, not to God, but to the hush he left behind. Cora underlined it 3 times, then circled, the hush he left behind. The next morning she received a call. The preservation team working at the bus site had cleared away a section of compacted silt near the rear wheel well. Inside, embedded into the undercarriage, they'd found an object wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax. She arrived just after sunrise. The lake bed was quiet again. The bus sat like a skeletal reliquary, less a vehicle now than a sealed room for something that had chosen not to leave. The crew stood respectfully back as Cora knelt beside the unearthed bundle. She peeled away the wax slowly. Inside, a torn page from a hymnal. On the back, a message in a tight, disciplined hand. He did not drive us to the retreat. There was no retreat. He took the bus off the path. She led the way. We followed, but she never knelt. Cora turned the page over. There, in faint but certain ink, Sister Claire. At noon, Cora returned to Miriam Holloway's cabin. The older woman answered the door before she could knock. "You saw the chapel," Miriam said. Cora nodded. "And I found Claire's name. She wasn't supposed to participate." "Claire was chosen to record," Miriam replied. "But she resisted. She was supposed to be the last voice before silence." "What happened to her?" Miriam closed her eyes. For a moment, Cora thought she wouldn't answer. "I don't know, but I remember hearing someone scream the night after the bus left. A sound that wasn't allowed." "You think it was her?" "I think she saw too much, and the rite wasn't meant for that." Cora took out the embroidered cloth and placed it on the table. Miriam stared at it for a long time. "They told us kneeling meant submission," she said at last. "But it was never about humility. It was about stillness, about agreeing to hear what no one should be listening to." Cora leaned forward. "What were they listening to?" Miriam's lips pressed thin. Her eyes glistened, but not from sadness, from remembering. A voice that doesn't use sound. And Cassiel taught them how. Outside, the wind stirred the trees once more. Cora stood by the porch, her mind thick with unformed questions. She looked back toward Miriam. "Why do you think the bus stayed buried all these years?" "Because whatever they invited in—" Miriam paused, gaze hardening. "It wasn't ready to be found." "But now," Miriam's voice dropped, "now it wants to be remembered." That night, Cora opened her childhood Bible, her mother's old one, the one with notes scrawled in the margins. Between Psalms 46 and 47, a piece of paper had been slipped in, not scripture. A handwritten line, circled again and again. Silence is not what remains after the voice. It is what comes before. Cora set the Bible down slowly. In the hall, the clock ticked, but only once. And outside, the woods held their breath. The old archivist's chapel was buried beneath the diocesan records building, a room even many church employees didn't know existed. It wasn't large, just a low stone chamber with a plain wooden altar and 4 benches arranged in a square. No windows, no stained glass, only a single flickering wall sconce and dust thick enough to soften your footsteps. Sheriff Cora Reyes descended the narrow stairwell with her flashlight angled low. The stairs creaked like memory, too fragile for weight, but still holding on. She hadn't come here by invitation. There were no keys, no schedule. Just a suggestion passed quietly by Jude, the archivist, who said without saying, "Sometimes the past is kept in places too sacred for filing cabinets." The room smelled of candle wax and silence. Cora stepped inside. There were no icons, no crucifix, no signs of traditional ritual. Only an empty frame above the altar where a painting had once hung. The plaster beneath it bore faint discoloration, the shape of a figure long since removed. She circled slowly, trailing her light along the stone. In the far corner, under the 4th bench, the beam caught something. A trapdoor carved so seamlessly into the flagstone it would have been missed without looking for it. She crouched, a small iron handle, cool to the touch. She pulled. The door creaked open with a shudder, revealing a hollow space no deeper than a foot. But inside, wrapped in linen and twine, was a tarnished wooden box. She lifted it out gently and placed it on the altar. The lid opened with resistance, like something inside had been pressing outward for years. Inside, 4 cassette tapes, no labels, no dates, just Roman numerals scratched faintly onto the plastic shells. I too. Sorry, and beneath them, folded carefully in a square of waxed parchment, was a handwritten note. They asked us not to speak, but some of us still remembered our voices. These are not confessions. They are echoes. Back at the station, Cora loaded the first tape. She closed her door, dimmed the lights, and pressed play. Tape eye static. Then a woman's voice. Low, hesitant. We began with silence, but it was not peaceful. It was waiting. That's what she told us. Sister Cassiel, that silence is not absence. It is anticipation. Something is always listening back. A pause. Then, when we kneeled, we were told not to close our eyes, not to pray, just to wait until it arrived. I don't know what we invited, only that it never left. Cora stopped the tape. Her pulse was steady, but something deeper, a tension under her ribs, tightened. She loaded tape 2. Tape 2, a different voice this time. Younger, brittle. Sister Claire cried during the 3rd night. She tried to leave, said the woods were whispering our names and they weren't using the right voices. I held her hand, told her to stay, but she went anyway. A sound, barely audible. Fabric rustling. Then silence. Then, she came back at dawn. Changed. She wouldn't speak after that. Not a word. But she kept writing. I think she was writing down what it told her. Cora paused the tape. Her hand went instinctively to the small cloth scrap she had preserved in a case. The one embroidered with Claire's name. She hadn't noticed it before. In the hem, almost invisible, a line of small thread shapes, symbols, not letters, just repeating curves and slashes. She turned the cloth under the desk lamp. They matched the symbols etched on the listening cross. Tape 3, a 3rd voice. Calm, controlled. Father Elroy never drove the bus, not really. He sat behind the wheel, but he didn't steer. Sister Cassiel stood beside him. She guided. She said the road had already been chosen long before we left. There were no roads where we went. Just turns the map forgot. By the time Cora loaded tape 4, the dusk had settled. The only light came from her desk lamp and the blinking red of the tape player. Tape 4. I'm not afraid anymore, because I think I'm already gone. My name is... A pause. The audio skips. Was Sister Naima. If you find this, don't listen to the silence. It's not empty. It remembers you, it calls you by your oldest name, the one no one else knows. And once you hear it, you kneel. That's how it starts. The tape ended in a long rising hiss that sounded too much like breath. Cora sat for a long time, the tapes spread across her desk like relics. She opened her notebook, wrote a single line. The benediction silence was not a ceremony. It was a response. Then she underlined one word, Naima. The voice had given a name, one of the missing 8s. She pulled up the personnel file. Sister Naima Akari, age 24, background in liturgical music, known for being contemplative, had written a thesis on the theology of silence before joining the order. There was a note beside her name in the retreat prep file, assigned primary observer for auditory record, sensitive to tone, chosen by Cassiel. At dawn, Cora returned to the ruins. She didn't bring a recorder. She didn't want to. She stood inside the shell of the chapel once more and listened. Not to the wind, not to the birds, but to the stillness behind the stillness. And in that deep quiet, beneath the groan of tree limbs and the faraway trickle of thawing snow, she heard it. A name, not spoken aloud, not heard with ears, but known, her own name, not Sheriff, not Cora. Something older, something she'd never spoken aloud. She knelt, without meaning to. And when she stood again, her hands were dirty. But she was holding a rosary, one she hadn't brought. The photo had always been there, tucked behind a glass frame in the diocesan yearbook archive. An image from 1971, preserved in the same faded colors as memory. It showed 8 postulants standing before the east cloister wall, hands clasped in front of their habits. Expressions blank from the kind of solemnity you learn, not feel. And then, just behind the stone column, the 9th figure. She wasn't looking at the camera. Her face was turned slightly, as if watching something the others couldn't see. Her veil darker. The cincture at her waist tied in a different knot, crossed rather than looped. And her shoes, unlike the others, weren't uniform issue. They looked handmade. Cora stared at the photo for a long time in her office, the paper warm from the scanner. When she'd first looked, she'd missed it. That's how most things worked in these stories. The truth didn't hide. It waited until you could see it. Her name came from a forgotten corner of the church's private registry. Not a public vow record, not a missionary file, just a line under special assignments. Vocational Silence Program, CASSIEL. Status, Transient Religious Affiliate, non-vowed. Assigned to Benediction Listening Cohort, Crescent County, California. Supervising Authority, Father M. Elroy, uncertified, clearance level. Voice final. Record sealed, 1973. There was no birth date, no family contact, no origin monastery. Just a presence, like something inserted mid-page. And a note, designated as the 9th sister, for observation and instruction only. No kneeling, no liturgy, voice only. The tapes had set it in pieces. She stood while the others knelt. She gave no prayers, but whispered scripture that didn't appear in any book. One of the voices had called her the one who listened back. Now her face appeared again. Not in the archives, but in a place Cora hadn't expected. Father Elias Holloway's private collection. He lived in the rectory of a rural parish, long retired. His memory not sharp, but not gone either. His sister had been Miriam, and though he rarely spoke to outsiders, he agreed to see Cora after only one question. Do you believe some prayers are not meant for God? He sat across from her in a chair worn thin with time. The shelves behind him bowed with books on ritual theology, early monastic traditions, and something called apophatic devotion, the practice of speaking by not speaking. Cora showed him the yearbook photo. He looked at it a long time, then nodded once. Cassiel. You remember her? I was asked to offer her shelter in the winter of 1970. She arrived barefoot, carried only a piece of driftwood and a jar of salt, said nothing for the first 4 days. And then, he smiled faintly. Then she began to teach us things we had no names for. He retrieved a box from beneath a low bookshelf. Inside, a stack of letters, most unaddressed. At the bottom, a sketchbook. He handed it to Cora. Inside were charcoal drawings, some abstract, some strikingly real. A woman standing before a row of kneeling figures, a circle of stone surrounded by trees, a hand reaching into water to lift a candle that still burned, and on one page, drawn carefully, deliberately, a sealed mouth, stitched not with thread but with branches, and the words, "We are quiet so that others can hear. We are empty so they may be filled." Cora turned the page. The next image showed a tree split in two, hollow at its center. Inside, a girl curled on the floor, clutching a notebook. Her wrist bore the listening cross. At the base of the drawing, in small, faint letters, "The ones who remember are not always the ones who return." Cora looked up. "What happened to her?" Father Elias didn't answer immediately. Then, "The last time I saw Cassiel was 2 days before the transport left. She stood in the chapel during evening silence, staring at the crucifix. But she wasn't praying. She was listening. And then, she walked out through the pine gate, no bag, no goodbye, just stepped into the trees." "Do you think she went with them?" "No," he said. "I think she led them." That night, Cora drove the back road to the site of the old logging gate, once the monastery's back exit. It was rusted now, one side hanging open like a mouth left mid-sentence. She stood where the path narrowed into dense trees. The moon was pale. She whispered her own question, not to anyone, not expecting reply. "Did you bring them somewhere?" And in the hush of the trees, the wind stirred. Not as an answer, but as acknowledgement. Behind her, in the brush, a sound, a soft scrape. She turned her flashlight slowly. At the base of the pine trunk, propped like it had been waiting, was an old wooden sign, worn but legible beneath the lichen, "The Listening Garden." And below that, carved faintly, "Leave your voice. Take only what listens." The sign was older than the tree it leaned against. That was Cora Reyes's first thought as she stood beneath the dim canopy at the edge of the overgrown trail. The words etched into the wood had faded, but the pressure of them still clung to the grain. The Listening Garden. Leave your voice. Take only what listens. She followed the trail deeper into the forest. It wound between tall, narrow pines whose limbs seemed to curve just slightly inward, as if they too had once gathered around something and never fully uncircled. Each step felt slower than the last, not heavier, just less her own, as if the path were deciding for her. After 20 minutes, she came to a clearing. Rocks encircled a wide ring of earth worn bare. No grass, no leaves, just dirt, disturbed but not recently. At the center, the remains of a stone pedestal cracked down the middle. Beside it, embedded in the ground, stood 8 low wooden posts arranged in a circle. The tops of each post had a shallow carved indentation for kneeling. Cora stood in the space between the 8th and 9th. There was a 9th. Not a post, just a hollowed place, like someone had once stood there, not kneeling, but watching. Something rustled to her right. She turned. A narrow path, barely wide enough for one person, led from the clearing toward a slope of bramble and stone. She hesitated. then stepped forward. 10 feet in, she found what she hadn't expected to see so clearly. An altar. Built into the base of the slope, half hidden behind tangled branches, it looked more like a stage of stone than a place for offering. A simple bench lay at its center. Carved above it, words in Latin, silentium loquitur, silence speaks. And beneath, something that hadn't been translated, possibly not Latin at all, kalak. The word struck something inside her. Not recognition exactly, but memory. Misplaced. She stepped closer. On the stone bench sat a rusted tin box, sealed with twine and wax. She opened it. Inside, a booklet. Handwritten, unlined pages, bound in red thread. Title: The Benediction Rite. Prepared and recorded by Sister Cassiel, Crescent County, 1972. She sat on the edge of the stone and turned the pages with deliberate care. Each was sparse. Some just a sentence, others entirely blank. The rite is not to sanctify, but to still. We listen not to find answers, but to become questions. 8 shall kneel, 1 shall bear. The silence is not absence. It is instruction. Then a diagram. The same circle of kneeling figures. The 9th standing apart. Lines extended from each of the 8 to the 9th. And beneath that, a phrase repeated 3 times, each written more urgently than the last. Do not speak the name that calls from the garden. Cora turned the page. There were only 2 more. One read, Claire wrote it down. She shouldn't have. And the last, the silence was never ours. We only carried it. She closed the booklet and sat still. The wind moved again, low and careful through the branches, and somewhere behind her, something like a bell chimed once, soft and unplaceable. She didn't turn to look. Instead, she opened her notebook and wrote. Cassiel didn't invent the rite. She remembered it. Back at the station, Cora laid the booklet beside the cassette tapes and the old journal. The pieces were aligning, but they didn't form a straight line. They spiraled, inward, as though the story wasn't expanding but collapsing, pulling itself back into the place where it began. She pinned a new note on the wall, beneath the photo of the kneeling figures. The benediction rite was not a moment. It was a seed, and underlined a single name, Claire. The next morning, Miriam Holloway was waiting on the sheriff's office porch. Her expression was unreadable. In her hand, she held something wrapped in linen. When Cora opened the door, Miriam stepped inside without speaking. She placed the bundle gently on the desk and unfolded the cloth. Inside was a small brass key and an address written on a strip of paper. Crescent Pines Storage. Unit 4. Cora looked up. What's there? Miriam's voice cracked. The pages Claire tried to hide. Later that day, Cora stood before the rusted roll-up door of Unit 4A. The air smelled of old wood and distant storms. She turned the key. The door groaned open to reveal only one item inside, a writing desk. Its drawers locked. One had a keyhole matching the brass key. Inside, pages, dozens of them, some torn from hymnals, others on blank paper, all written in a small, fast, careful hand. Each one a record, a message, a translation, names, symbols, instructions, and one repeated sentence. He listens through us, not to us. At the bottom of the drawer, beneath the pages, lay a photograph. It showed a circle of women kneeling in the clearing, their hands resting on their thighs. Their mouths were open, but their faces entirely silent. At the center, behind them, stood a tall woman in a dark veil. Her hands were raised, not in blessing, but in stillness. Cora turned the photo over. In faint pencil, the moment just before. Rain fell lightly over Crescent County for the first time in weeks. Not enough to fill the lake or soften the cracked earth, but enough to mist the air, to hush the trees, and to carry the scent of wet pine back through the valley. It sounded like memory returning slowly, drop by drop. Sheriff Cora Reyes stood once again before the bus in the lake bed. The preservation team had gone, the last forensic sweep completed. The chain around the door remained where it had been found, looped tightly across the entrance, secured with a rusted padlock that no longer locked anything. She reached out and touched the metal. It was colder than the air around it. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, she imagined 8 hands placing it there together. Not to trap something inside, but to keep something from calling back out. Inside the bus, everything had been catalogued. The rosary beneath the seat, the cracked mirror above the driver's panel, a wax-stamped envelope with no seal remaining. But something had changed since the last visit. Cora noticed it before she even crossed the threshold. The air. It was warm, not humid, not decayed. Alive. She stepped inside, boots creaking on the warped metal floor. The back of the bus still smelled faintly of dust and time. But now, near the final seat on the left, a candle had been placed. Small, white, unscented. It had burned down almost to the base. Wax pooled around it on the floor, still soft, recent. She turned quickly, scanning for signs of forced entry, movement, footprints, but the mud outside remained undisturbed. No prints, no rain-washed trails, only stillness. She crouched beside the candle. There, pressed beneath it, was a folded square of linen, similar to the one that had once held Claire's embroidered name. This one had no name, only a symbol stitched faintly in silver thread, the listening cross, split at the center, and beneath it, a line, "He speaks once." The rest is echo. Cora stood slowly. The chain hadn't been broken. It had been unhooked. She returned to the sheriff's office, quiet in the early evening, and pulled out the original evidence bag containing Claire's cloth, the one with the hidden symbols. She laid both pieces side by side. Same weave, same stitching pattern. But one was meant to be seen, the other to be placed. She turned the second cloth over. On the back, in handwriting identical to Claire's, though slightly less certain, not all were chosen to return. Some were chosen to remain, to guard what listens, to guard each other. She whispered aloud, barely above breath. One remained on the bus. That night, Cora drove to the edge of town, to the home of Father Elias Holloway. The rain had stopped. The trees stood still again. He opened the door before she could knock, as if he'd been expecting her. He held something in his hand, a letter, yellowed and sealed with wax that had long since cracked. "She left it with me in 1973, he said. Said I wouldn't understand it until I heard my name in silence. He handed it to her without explanation. Cora unfolded the letter slowly. The ink had faded, but the message was intact. To whoever finds this, you won't find all of us. That's not how it works. The ones you seek, some returned in ways not easy to explain. Others remained with what they were asked to carry. Claire was the first to stand when she should have knelt. She was also the first to kneel when she should have fled. She understood too much, and she took that understanding with her. I think she still guards the threshold, not because she has to, because she chose to. C. The signature was nothing more than an initial, but the ink trailed in a way that reminded Cora of charcoal sketches and red thread bindings. Cassiel, she remembered, and she was still speaking. That weekend, the forensic team returned to the site one final time to lift the bus frame from the mud. Not to take it apart, just to move it, to see beneath. What they found stunned them into stillness. Beneath the bus, preserved in silt and root, was a stone ring, 9 points etched into its surface, arranged in a circle. One stone at the center was darker than the rest, and on it, carved faintly, the symbol of the listening cross, split like an open door. Later that night, Cora reviewed the recovered journal pages again. One passage stood out. Cassiel's voice, or perhaps Claire's. It was hard to tell anymore. We were told silence would protect us, but we learned silence remembers too. It builds upon itself, until even our thoughts are not our own. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see a door, and through it, I hear the ones who didn't kneel. They're still singing. The bus was gone now, lifted from the lake bed and taken to a secure site under the county's preservation directive. What remained was a pit, wide and cracked, the kind of wound that doesn't bleed but never really closes either. It held a silence that didn't seem to belong to nature. Sheriff Cora Reyes stood at the edge of the depression where the vehicle had rested for 50 years. She stared down at the stone ring exposed beneath it, each point etched with a symbol that time had not erased. 9 points, one darker than the others, one that didn't reflect light even when her flashlight passed directly over it. It was the center, the bearing point, according to the notes left behind by Cassiel. That morning, while reviewing the last batch of recovered artifacts from the hollow beneath the bus, a technician had handed her a photograph. It had been sealed in a plastic folder wedged into the chassis, an area undisturbed until the bus was moved. The photo showed a small group of women seated in a clearing around what looked like a campfire. No veils, plain clothes, hair loose, eyes wide. The flames were faint, the shadows long, but one figure stood out. She was looking directly into the camera, not with fear, with knowing. Her name wasn't written on the back, just a phrase, printed in faded ink. She stayed because she remembered. Cora traced the woman's face with her thumb. It wasn't Cassiel. It wasn't Claire. She didn't match any of the names listed in the retreat manifest. But her face appeared again in a journal page Cassiel had written in the margins, in near illegible script. Sometimes the ones who carry the silence don't have names anymore, but we still remember the way they watched us, the way they listened without question. That evening, Cora returned to the county hospital. There, in a quiet ward, Miriam Holloway sat with her brother Elias, both of them reviewing old prayer notes. Cora placed the photograph on the tray table in front of Miriam. "Do you recognize her?" Miriam stared, then nodded once. "That's the one Claire called the anchor." Anchor. The one who bore the silence when the others couldn't. There was always someone chosen to stay behind. "She's not listed anywhere." "She wouldn't be," Miriam said softly. "She wasn't part of the rite. She was what the rite was built around." Later that night, back at the station, Cora reread the last pages of Claire's hidden writings. They were fragmentary, like someone had written in fevered memory. "He didn't take us by force. He didn't have to. We were already listening. The silence we invited in didn't want obedience. It wanted witnesses. I was one. I think I still am. If they find the bus, they'll find the garden. And if they find the garden, they'll find what we left to keep the door closed." The following morning, a diver named Ruben Martinez, who had helped lift the bus, called Cora in hushed tones. We went back into the basin, checked beneath the stone ring, not for official reasons, just curiosity. And there's a chamber. Cora stood still. A what? An underground room, sealed with rusted bolts, about the size of a prayer room. It's marked with the same symbol, the cross that splits. "Did you enter it?" "No, Sheriff, we didn't open anything. But someone has," he added, his voice tightening, "because the bolts were unlocked from the inside." She arrived an hour later with 2 deputies and a preservation officer. The chamber was exactly as described. A low, square vault beneath the stone circle, reachable by a narrow crawl space worn into the earth. The door bore no handle, only a carved recess shaped like an open hand. Inside, the air was dry, too dry, preserved, dustless. A chair stood in the center, not a pew, not a confessional, just a plain wooden chair, and beside it, on the floor, a metal box. Cora opened it slowly. Inside, a bracelet, plastic, purple, small. etched with a name in careful, childlike lettering, K-I-M-I. Her throat tightened. Kimmy. She called Miriam again, described what they'd found. Miriam grew quiet. Kimmy wasn't supposed to return. She said so in her last entry. You read it? Claire shared it with me, just once, said it was the only time Kimmy spoke out loud during the entire retreat. What did she say? Miriam's voice was barely audible now. She said, I'll stay if it means no one else has to kneel again. Cora placed the bracelet in an evidence bag and sat beside the open chamber door for a long time. The silence inside didn't feel empty. It felt careful, like a room still holding its breath. She left at dusk. The forest around the lake was still. No wind, no birds, no echoes. Just a presence. The kind you don't disturb. The kind you thank quietly and then leave behind. The file was closed. Not solved, not explained, just closed. Stamped by the county, filed under historic anomaly, and marked for archiving by the diocese. No official statements, no final names confirmed. The church offered a memorial service, short and cautious in its language, a nod to those who had given themselves to silence. But Sheriff Cora Reyes knew better. The bus hadn't been a tomb. It had been a threshold, and someone had stayed to hold the door shut. The vehicle now rested in a preservation facility outside Sacramento. It sat behind temperature-controlled glass, elevated on steel beams. Visitors walked its perimeter in silence, passing information plaques and archival notes. Few lingered near the back left seat, the one with the candle wax and scorched floorboard. But Cora had, twice. And each time she swore the air was warmer in that part of the room. Not stifling, not humid, just held, like something in the space remembered being chosen. In the final weeks of her term, Cora returned once more to the monastery ruins. Spring had begun to soften the forest floor. The trail to the listening garden had overgrown again, branches low, as if warning her gently to turn back. She didn't. When she stepped into the clearing, it was quiet, utterly, completely quiet. No birds, no wind, just stillness, so deep it felt aware. In the center of the stone ring, a new white lily had bloomed. It hadn't been there before, it hadn't been planted. And beside it, resting on the stone pedestal, a journal. Her journal. The one she had lost weeks earlier at the base of the chamber. Now closed, with a final sentence written in her own handwriting that she didn't remember writing. You do not kneel for silence, you hold it. That night, she lit a single candle in her home, placing it on the windowsill. Same kind as the one found on the bus. Unscented, white, short. She sat with the flame for a long time, then opened the envelope she had avoided since the discovery of the underground chamber. The one marked K-I-M-I. If found, do not open unless alone inside, a child's drawing. Crayon on brown paper, a ring of kneeling women, a tree in the background. And above the tree, a small shape, a mouth without lines, wide and watching. At the bottom, in uneven print, tell the others I stayed because I listened better. Weeks later, Cora visited Miriam Holloway one final time. The hospital chapel was empty except for them. Miriam was older now, softer, but her voice still carried a quiet certainty. I've been thinking, Cora said, about Claire, about Cassiel, about what they gave up. Miriam nodded. They didn't give it up, they gave it forward. And the others? They returned in their own ways. Just not to places with maps. Did they survive? Miriam smiled gently. They were never meant to survive it. They were meant to carry it. Cora left the chapel with the air feeling lighter behind her. Not resolved, not lifted, just acknowledged. And that was enough. She wrote one last note in her own journal, in the margin beside the photograph of the bus seat. Some prayers aren't meant to reach heaven. They stay here, they wait, and sometimes they're answered, not by miracles, but by memory. She closed the book and lit one more candle. At the edge of Morning Lake, the earth had begun to soften. Grass crept back across the lake bed. Trees leaned closer. A pine that had stood hollow for decades had sprouted new growth, and at its base, beneath the roots, just barely visible in the loam, a small brass chain, a bracelet, still bearing the name, Kimi, wrapped around a wax-stiffened piece of cloth, embroidered faintly with silver thread. No name, only a symbol, the listening cross, split but never broken.